The smell of butter and flour frying in a cast iron skillet on a Sunday morning. Not from any restaurant, but from the kitchen of a woman at the end of the block. This is Arkansas in 1961, a land where summers ran hot enough to soften the blacktop and Sunday mornings carried the scent of coffee, laundry soap, and church bells. In that year, over 1,800,000 people called this state home, roughly equal to the entire population of Houston, Texas at the time. And if you grew up here, you knew that every Sunday morning, the whole state seemed to pause, draw one long breath, and go to church. This is the story of those mornings, those Sunday dinners after church, and the most ordinary moments of a life that no longer exists quite the same way. Let's begin before the rest of the house woke, when the rooms were still quiet and the woman in the kitchen had been on her feet since 5 o'clock. The Arkansas woman of 1961 was usually up before everyone else, lighting the stove, putting the percolator on before the sky had even turned gray. The rural Arkansas home of that era was usually a single-story wood frame house, painted white with a wide front porch, wooden shutters flanking every window, and a pecan or oak keeping watch from the front yard. The bedroom floorboards creaked in ways you knew by heart, and you learned exactly which steps would wake the person beside you and which ones you could steal past safely. The radio on the kitchen windowsill started its gospel program at 6 in the morning, not because anyone switched it on, but because that was what it always did at that hour, and no one thought to change it. A weekday breakfast might be leftover biscuits and coffee, but Sunday morning was different entirely. The one day of the week when everyone sat down at the same time. Fried eggs and butter, a strip or two of bacon, hot biscuits with muscadine or fig preserves. That is what an Arkansas table looked like on a Sunday morning in 1961. After breakfast, the whole family prepared for church in a sequence that never varied, regardless of the year or the season. White dress shirts were ironed on Saturday evening and hung on the bedroom door, and everyone understood those shirts were not touched before Sunday. The family car was usually a late 1950s Ford or Chevrolet, washed and wiped down on Saturday afternoon, and the smell of hot vinyl inside on a summer Sunday was something you could never confuse with anything else. And then the whole street began to move. Doors opening one by one, families stepping out, all heading in the same direction, without anyone having to say a word. That is one of the things that is mostly gone. Not the churches themselves, they are still there, but the shared rhythm of an entire neighborhood moving in the same direction at the same hour every week. The Southern Baptist Church was the center of social life in Arkansas in 1961, in a very literal sense, not a metaphor. In a typical Arkansas town of the 1960s, the church was not only a place of worship, it was where you learned who had a new baby, who was sick, and whose farm needed hands the following week. Consider this. In 1960, there were over 45,000 Southern Baptist churches operating across America, more than the total number of post offices in the United States at the same time. After the service, people lingered outside the church, the way nobody was in a hurry to leave, everyone carrying a small question or a small piece of news they had been waiting to pass along. Do you remember standing on the church lawn in shoes that were still a little too tight, and you couldn't take them off because you were in your Sunday clothes, so you just stood there and endured it and smiled? And then, around noon, everything converged on a single destination: Sunday dinner. Sunday dinner in Arkansas was not lunch in the ordinary sense. It was the most important event of the week, prepared since the day before, and since early that same morning. Fried chicken was the soul of that meal. Not chicken from a store, but a yard bird, killed on Saturday morning, soaked overnight in salt and buttermilk, then fried in hot lard in a cast iron skillet on the gas stove. Alongside that would be a pot of butter beans that had been simmering since early morning, mashed potatoes beaten by hand with real butter and whole milk, cornbread baked in a cast iron pan, and a pitcher of sweet iced tea already waiting in the refrigerator. The main street of an Arkansas County seat in 1961 was not just a place to shop, it was where you could read the pulse of an entire community in a single short walk. The barber shop opened Saturday morning at 7 and ran until evening, and the waiting chairs were never empty, not because everyone needed a haircut, but because that was where men learned what was happening in the county. The drugstore with a soda fountain was where children and teenagers landed after Sunday service. A cherry Coke for 5 cents and a spinning stool were enough to turn an afternoon into a memory. Arkansas children of the 1960s did not know air conditioning for most of that decade, but they did not need to know it when the whole summer was one long outdoor adventure. The games children played were simple in terms of materials, but demanded enormous imagination. A vacant lot could be a baseball field, a battlefield, or a racetrack within the same afternoon. Consider this. In 1960, more than 90% of American children regularly played outside without adult supervision, a figure that is almost impossible to imagine today. On weekday afternoons, men who worked the farms or the sawmills usually carried their lunch in a tin pail, resting in the shade of a tree or beside the truck for about 30 minutes before standing up and going back to it. Arkansas's economy in 1961 still leaned heavily on agriculture, particularly cotton, timber, and soybeans, with more than 40% of the state's population living in rural areas. The average daily wage for a farm laborer in Arkansas in that era was around $2 a day, enough to buy 5 loaves of bread, or enough gasoline for a week of driving in an older car. The sawmill was one of the largest employers in many Arkansas counties in that era, and the scent of pine sap from fresh-cut lumber was something tens of thousands of Arkansas men knew every morning when they arrived for work. Main Street in an Arkansas town had everything you needed within walking distance: a grocery, a feed store, a dry goods shop, a doctor's office, and at least 2 eating places where the owner knew your name. That diner might be nothing more than 6 tables and a counter with 8 stools, but you could eat a full-plate lunch of ham, mashed potatoes, green beans, and bottomless coffee for under $1. The refrigerator in an Arkansas kitchen of that era was usually a big white unit with chrome handles, putting out a steady motor hum and the occasional clatter of ice in the freezer compartment. Do you remember the sound of an old refrigerator motor, that steady mechanical hum that no refrigerator makes anymore? The one you only recall when someone mentions it. The telephone in rural Arkansas in that era was often a party line, meaning you shared the line with 2 or 3 neighboring households, and everyone understood that anyone could listen in if they picked up at the right moment. People did not stay on the phone too long, not out of politeness exactly, but because the neighbors might need the line, and everyone was aware of that unspoken obligation. Children who grew up in Arkansas in that era had summers with no summer camp schedule, no organized activities, no screen to look at, just time and space and neighbors their own age. For millions of Americans who grew up in small southern towns in that era, knowing the name of everyone on the street was not something remarkable. It was simply how things were. Neighbors in Arkansas in that era were not people you chose, but the relationship carried real obligations. If their roof blew off in a storm, you went over and helped put it back. The county fair in fall was the single largest social event of the year. In many Arkansas counties, larger than Christmas in terms of how many people gathered and how much noise there was. The domestic and farm produce booths at the fair were where women brought the jams they had put up, the quilts they had stitched by hand, and the pies they had baked to compete for the county blue ribbon, and they valued that ribbon as much as any trophy. Children went to the fair with 25 cents in their pocket and felt wealthy because with 25 cents, they could ride 3 rides, buy a bag of popcorn, and still have change left for the walk home. The black and white television arrived in many Arkansas homes sometime between the late 1950s and early 1960s, and it did not replace the radio immediately. For several years, the two coexisted in the same house, like 2 guests who did not quite know each other. The rooftop antenna for picking up the television signal did not always cooperate, and the oldest child was often assigned the job of sitting on the porch and turning the antenna while the rest of the family shouted from inside, "Better stop there, too far, come back." An Arkansas summer was not something you endured inside an air-conditioned room. It was something you lived inside, with sweat and red dust and the unbroken sound of cicadas from morning until dark. The standing fan in the corner of the living room turned slowly through summer nights, doing little to actually cool anything, but its steady hum was the lullaby of an entire generation that grew up before air conditioning. On the hottest days, nearly everyone drifted to the front porch after the midday meal. Not for any particular reason, just because the inside of the house was hotter than outside, and the late afternoon breeze might pass through. The independent grocery in an Arkansas town of that era was a place where the owner knew your name, knew your family, and could sometimes let you run a tab until the end of the month if payday had not come yet. The average weekly grocery budget for a family of 4 in Arkansas in 1961 was around $25 to $30, which would be equivalent to over $300 in today's money. The things that have completely vanished from the Arkansas landscape, and not just Arkansas, but most of America, are the ones you do not realize you miss until you look at an old photograph. The milk deliveryman knew every family on his route by name and knew which days which household would need an extra bottle of cream. Those glass milk bottles were returned each day, rinsed and reused, and the child who remembered to put the empties out by the front door was considered the responsible one in the family. The drive-in theater is something no one can quite picture accurately unless they have been to one. Not the screen, not the speaker hanging in the car window, but the feeling of sitting in a warm car on a summer night watching a film under an open sky. At the peak of the 1960s, there were more than 4,000 drive-in theaters operating across America, a number that exceeded the total indoor movie screens in the country at the same time. People dressed up to go to the drive-in just as they would for an indoor movie, and children in pajamas asleep in the back seat was perfectly ordinary because most of them were out before the second feature ended. Winter in Iltal, in Arkansas, Elivdaking Sos in Arkansas, was not as brutal as in the northern states, but it was cold enough to make the coal or wood stove in the living room the center of the house during December and January. On winter evenings, the whole family pulled their chairs toward the stove the way plants lean toward light. And that was when the card games, the storytelling, and the reading happened most naturally. A kitchen garden out back was common to most Arkansas families in that era, not a hobby or a trend, but a practical way to cut the food bill and ensure fresh vegetables through the summer. Summer canning was heavy all-day work. The kitchen, already hot from summer, was now full of boiling pots and lids. But the jars of tomatoes, okra, and preserves lined up on the pantry shelf were the winter's insurance. Those filled rows of glass jars were not just stored food. For people who had lived through the memory of the Great Depression or the lean years of the Second World War, those jars were evidence that the family would be all right. The things that have gone from modern Arkansas and cannot be found again include the home milk delivery, the wood or coal cooking stove in the kitchen, the operating drive-in in most counties, the party line telephone, and the independent Main Street grocery, where the owner knew your name. But some things have persisted. The red dirt roads of rural Arkansas are still there, and the small white-painted wooden country church at a crossroads in the middle of a field still stands. And the smell of charcoal smoke on a Sunday afternoon still drifts through many Arkansas neighborhoods, even if the grill is propane now instead of lump charcoal. Sunday afternoon after the midday meal had a rhythm of its own, slower than any other afternoon of the week, as if the whole community had agreed to pause together for a while. Evening in Arkansas in 1961 started earlier than it does now, not because the sun set sooner, but because there was little reason to be outside after dark, and the day had already been long. The family dinner was not an idea or an ideal. It was simply what happened at 6 in the evening because nobody had anything else scheduled. And the dining table was the one place with enough chairs for everyone. Children were expected to wash their hands before dinner, sit down, and not talk with their mouths full. Rules that were never explained but repeated until they became reflex. A weeknight supper in Arkansas in that era was not elaborate. A pot of pinto beans with salt pork, a pan of cornbread, a few green onions from the garden, and a glass of milk for the children. After supper, the dishes were washed by hand, not because dishwashers were unavailable, but because a dishwasher was not something most Arkansas families had in that era. And washing dishes was something the household did together, in silence or in talk about the day. The front porch after supper was the real social space of the neighborhood. People did not schedule a porch visit. They simply went out and sat down. And if someone passed by, they stopped. And if they didn't, that was fine too. Do you remember the feeling of sitting on the porch steps on a summer evening when the sky was still light enough to see each other, but the fireflies had already started blinking in the grass? The evening radio carried the 6 o'clock news, then a country music program at 7, and by 8, if you had a television, the whole family came inside to watch the one program that everyone in the country was watching at the same time. There were only 3 television networks in 1961. In most markets, NBC, CBS, and ABC. And if you did not watch at the time it aired, you had missed it entirely because there was nothing to rewind. Children went to bed at 8:30 or 9, not because parents forced it, but because there was nothing left to do once the adult programs came on, and the bedroom lamp was too dim to read by for very long. The evening habits of adults, after the children were in bed, were simple. Reading the paper, finishing small jobs left over from the day, writing a letter to relatives far away, or simply sitting still and doing nothing at all. That kind of community, where neighbors knew one another and children could walk alone 3 blocks to a friend's house, created a kind of psychological safety that is difficult to put into modern words. That does not mean that life was without hardship. It had hardship, and it was real and heavy, but the thickness of the community was a cushion against that weight in a way many people today no longer have. When full dark came to the small Arkansas towns, the night sky was far darker than it is today because there were few streetlights and no big box stores along a highway lighting up the whole sky. People slept earlier, rose earlier, and lived according to the rhythm of natural light in a way that most modern Americans have completely lost connection with. And before sleep, in many Southern Baptist households, there was a short prayer, not loud, not performed, just a few words spoken aloud in the dark room before closing your eyes after a long Sunday. That is how an ordinary Sunday in Arkansas in 1961 came to a close, not with a bang or a big event, but with the tick of a clock and the fading of the cicadas. The things that remain from that era are not things you find in a museum. They are things you sometimes encounter unexpectedly on a drive through rural Arkansas. Some of the small wooden churches at rural Arkansas crossroads still open every Sunday. And if you drive past at the right hour, you can see the cars parked outside and hear the singing through the open windows. And the smell of Sunday fried chicken is something that millions of Arkansans, whether living in Little Rock or Los Angeles, still carry in memory like a fourth dimension that has nothing to do with time or distance. The last generation that carries vivid living memory of Arkansas life in the 1960s is now in their 80s and older, people born in the late 1930s or early 40s who grew up precisely in that time. Those small memories, the smell of Sunday morning biscuits, the church bells at 9, the old refrigerator motor in the kitchen, are not unimportant historical details. They are how a generation understands who they are, where they came from, and what makes the feeling called home. And when that community changed, when the drive-in closed, when the milk deliveryman stopped coming, when the little crossroads church began to empty out, what was lost was not only a service or a convenience. What was lost was the invisible social structure that bound people who were not family, but who shared a street, a county, a small southern state. But it did not disappear entirely. It transformed, sometimes becoming thinner, sometimes finding new forms, and sometimes you still encounter it in a handshake at a funeral or a pot of soup left at a sick neighbor's door. Why do these small memories matter more than we think? Because they are not only memories of a place or a time, they are a map of the ways people need each other. 1961 in Arkansas was not a golden age. It had its own cracks and shadows like every era. But the rhythm of that ordinary daily life, the way a Sunday moved from morning biscuits to an evening prayer, was real. And for the millions who grew up in this state in those years, it was not only real, it was the only thing they knew about how the world was supposed to work. And now, if you drive along the red clay roads of a rural Arkansas county on a summer Sunday morning, you can still sometimes hear a church bell from a long way off. It doesn't ring as clearly as it once did. Distance and time have softened it, but it is still there, sounding as if it doesn't know the world around it has changed. Consider this. In 1961, over 92% of Arkansans identified as members of a religious congregation, the highest rate of any of the 50 states at that time. That was not just a statistic. It was the foundation of the weekly rhythm, the way children knew where they belonged, the way the elderly were not alone in illness, and the way the whole community knew who needed help. The people of Arkansas in that era did not call their life remarkable or memorable. They called it Wednesday or Thursday or Sunday, and they simply kept living it. And precisely because they did not call it remarkable, precisely because it was only their ordinary life, it became the thing people remember longest. The smell of butter and flour in a cast iron skillet on a Sunday morning, the church bells at 9, the cicadas at noon in summer, the slow fan turning through the night. Those are things most neighborhoods don't have anymore, but those things still live in the memory of the people who once had them. And that memory is not sentimental luxury or useless longing. It is evidence that a community existed, truly lived, and shaped people who carry it with them as part of how they understand the world. If you grew up in Arkansas in those years, you know exactly what that Sunday morning looked like. You know the smell of it, the sound of it, and the feeling of stiff new church shoes on a child's feet while trying to stand still on the church lawn. And if you didn't grow up there, if you only heard about it through your parents' or grandparents' stories, you know enough to understand why the people who lived it never quite leave it behind. The smell of butter and flour in a cast iron skillet on a Sunday morning in Arkansas in 1961, if you close your eyes long enough. You still can. This is Arkansas, 1961. We would love to hear from you. If you grew up in Arkansas or anywhere in the South in those years, share one small memory in the comments below.